in Canada as well. As Johanna told you, there are usually several factors that go into the size and scope of these fires. One of those is definitely climate change. A hotter, drier climate. Canada's Trudeau government has insisted that tackling climate change is a top priority. We are signatory to the UN's Paris Climate Accord, and the government has rolled out its carbon tax program to get emissions down. But at the same time, the government is invested in pipelines. Which brings me to our question for the panel tonight. Is the Canadian government's environmental policy to tackle climate change more style over substance? Joining me from Toronto tonight to address that question, Muneeza Sheikh. She's a partner at employment lawyer in Levitt LLP. Author and freelance columnist Michael Coren joins us again tonight. And Macdonald-Laurier Institute senior fellow Sean Speer. All right, Muneeza, let me start with you tonight. What do you think? Is our climate policy, our environmental policy more style over substance?
I do think there's a significant amount of substance as far as it relates to the federal government, specifically on the carbon tax policy. I think they truly do. The federal government does make a fairly compelling argument. But with all that being said, Carole, I'm not necessarily making the point that there isn't some room for criticism here. So when looking at the carbon tax issue specifically, in the 2015 platform for the federal government, yes, they specifically addressed the issue of dealing with, emissions, dealing with issues around the environment as far as it related to the emissions, but we didn't really hear anything about a carbon tax. What we heard instead, Carole, was about, coming up with a policy that incentivizes provinces to lower their emissions and where they necessarily have a plan. And now we're talking about a tax. Now, with all of that being said, I think the biggest problem that the federal government has, they make a compelling argument, but I don't necessarily think to the average layperson, and Carole, I'm going to lump myself into this category, I don't think they don't do a great job of explaining what that incentive tax rebate looks like for the average family. So if I'm listening, or if I'm basically trying to understand what this carbon tax means, all I hear is I'm paying all this money up front, and in some underhanded way I get it back, but I don't understand it, Carole.
All right. Let's we'll delve into that in just a moment. Michael, what do you think? Do you think the environmental policy overall of this government is style more than substance, or not?
Well, I've never heard that accusation thrown at the Liberal government ever before about anything, so it's news to me. Yeah, of course it is, and so they're allied to the rest of the world. One or two countries, relatively small countries, are really trying to change their climate culture. I think that's a phrase we should use. But in the case of Canada, the government has talked a good game, a better one than the Conservative government or the Conservative opposition, but not much is being done. Carbon tax, the very phrase sounds pejorative because no one likes to pay tax unless they're particularly masochistic, but it is a way to try and stop us from doing something. In that way, it's a sin tax, as with alcohol or tobacco or whatever. We have to change the way we approach fossil fuels and the way we try and protect the environment. Again, I'm not an expert, but I think we're all intelligent people. We can read the accounts by scientists who do know their stuff. And there is not a scientist worth the name who disagrees with the consensus that we have between about 12 and 15 years to do anything. Otherwise, maybe not in my lifetime, but in the lives of my children, we will see a planet, and this is not hyperbole, this is not rhetoric, that will be radically different and dangerous. And it's not that every fire we see and every problem we see is caused by climate change, but it's a contributing factor. We know this to be the case. But look, democracy means we have a change of government. Thank God for that. But we need people to come together, Conservative and Liberal, and say, it's rather like a foreign foe, a form of national socialism. We can bind together to fight it. Climate change is not about party politics. And I don't understand why politicians aren't sufficiently brave to say to people, look, it is going to be painful. You probably will pay more if you want to use fossil fuels. You may lose certainly the second car, maybe even change the way you approach driving cars. But unless we have a radical, profound change in climate culture, we're in huge trouble.
I agree with much of what Michael has just said. The extent to which this hasn't been a partisan issue, he's right. Inaction has transcended partisanship. Really, since the Kyoto Accord was signed, we've seen successive governments mostly involved in style over substance. Where I also agree is on the way that the government has chosen to frame this issue. We hear frequently from the Prime Minister, from the Minister of the Environment, and other spokespeople for the government that the environment and the economy go hand in hand. This implies that there are no trade-offs to be had here. And the problem with that, of course, is it's false. And so unless we're going to be honest with Canadians about the nature of these trade-offs, when costs start to bite due to climate action, people are naturally going to push back because they haven't been brought along. Just one example.
Yeah.
Here in the province of Ontario, we've had artificially high hydro rates in order to stimulate new renewable energy sources. You can agree or disagree with the policy, but because the previous government here in the province failed to bring the public along, the public naturally reacted. And then what we saw was the government scramble to try to reduce the cost, to kick them down the road. Because they hadn't, at the outset, been clear to Canadians about the nature of these trade-offs.
So is that the missing piece of the puzzle then, Sean? Is that where the substance is missing, and that it's in the communication and delivery of what's going to be required?
Well, I think if you establish that these trade-offs exist, then we can have a reasoned debate about the nature of those trade-offs. I suspect that I'm prepared to trade off economic activity, less economic activity in exchange for progress on the environment than, say, Michael or Muneeza might be. But I think that's the nature of the conversation we need to have.
Yes.
The idea that that these two things go hand in hand, for all intents and purposes, shuts down that debate and enables politicians to continue to talk a good game, but essentially do nothing.
But that's the problem. The problem is that I don't necessarily know that the Conservative government, whether it's through the federal government or whether it's the provincial allies, are even attempting to talk a good game. I think what they're doing is capitalizing, being overly opportunistic and saying that, look, this just translates into more money. And I think the Liberal government, where I fault them, and I'll say it again because, Carole, I think it's a critical point. I think their communication strategy with respect to explaining to your average Canadian, especially in the face of a federal election, in terms of what this incentive rebate, carbon dividend, whatever they want to call it, all these fancy phrases, which I don't think sound good. But I think the biggest problem is, from the Conservative government standpoint, Carole, it all seems very opportunistic. I don't necessarily hear, any sort of solution. I mean, what I would have expected to hear is a carbon tax doesn't work, but here's why it might work better within a regulatory framework.
But Muneeza, to your point, is it that, are people mistrustful of what you mentioned, or is it really that they don't know how much it's going to help? And I'll put an example on the table. There's British Columbia implemented a revenue-neutral carbon price in 2008, saw its emissions drop. There was political blowback in 2012. They froze their carbon price at 30 Canadian dollars per metric ton. And unsurprisingly, the writer writes, emissions started rising again.
But Carole, here's what we know.
Because they were frightened of losing the election. I mean, a lot of very good points have been made here. I want to say one thing, though, quite clearly. I said it's not a partisan issue. I said it shouldn't be a partisan issue. But witness the recent cover of Maclean's with a group of Conservative leaders fighting the carbon tax.
Oh, yes, I saw that photo.
I think a lot of us did. And it was widely mocked. But, that's, good for Maclean's. It got a lot of people looking at it. But there is, within the Conservative movement, a great fear of statism. And there are some people who deny, but there are others who minimize. What they say is, yes, it is an issue, it is a problem, but we can't rely on the state to solve anything, particularly this. And if we give the state too much power to tax us or control the way we drive and use energy, that's a problem. So in effect, they're on the wrong side. And I think that infects the Conservative movement provincially and federally. The Liberals aspire to something better, but in all honesty, they haven't achieved it. And the best that they're doing provincially or federally is really holding back something, a wave which is coming further and further towards us. But when it comes to communications, yeah, absolutely. There was a patronising attitude on the part of the Ontario Liberal government, and federally, there's simply poor communications. I don't quite understand what they're trying to do. And nor is it absolutely true that carbon tax is the best way to try and deal with climate change.
But what about from a regulatory standpoint, I think that would be even worse, because we hear Ford saying on the provincial side that, look, once this is implemented, we're going to challenge it in the courts. And I got to tell you, Carole, as a lawyer, that concerns me significantly, because carbon tax issue is not something that should be dealt with in a regulatory framework, whether that's in a court or before an administrative tribunal. The issue is going to get lost, and I can assure you, Carole, those vice chairs or those judges are not going to understand the issue around carbon tax.
I want to play Conservative leader Andrew Scheer's response to this, calling carbon tax electioneering, and here's why he claims it won't work. Take a listen.
We will be unveiling our plan that will speak to reducing Canada's emissions, that will be based on incentives rather than punishments, and it'll look to capitalize on Canada's ability to manufacture things, to process things with clean energy and with higher environmental standards. So we're not just displacing jobs and emissions to other countries. That being said, let's be very clear about Trudeau's plan. He has granted a special deal to those who pollute the most. Large industrial polluters with well-connected government relations experts have negotiated themselves an exemption.
Does Andrew Scheer's future plan make sense to you, Sean Speer?
Well, his point about what economists refer to as carbon leakage, that is that if our regulatory or our carbon price, if our environmental standards are more stringent than competing countries, competing jurisdictions, that not only will that production and those jobs move elsewhere, the emissions will as well. And the reason this is a problem is because not only will it have a negative economic effect for Canada, if our industry is actually relatively greener, it may actually lead to higher emissions. So the issue of carbon leakage is a serious one. And as I said, comes back to this point about this difficult tension, this difficult trade-off between the economic costs and long-term, but difficult to discern environmental gains. And the point it seems to me, though, is we need to have a more dispassionate conversation here about those trade-offs and then the right tools to get there. The reason why I think Mr. Trudeau's policy is so frustrating in many ways is that he's leaned in rhetorically to the importance and the need for action, but then at the end his policy is relatively timid. Virtually everyone agrees that a carbon tax to have a significant influence on behavior and ultimately to move us in the direction of our Paris targets will have to be markedly higher than $10 per ton.
Yes,
and so, as I say, I think there's a pox on virtually everyone's house here. If we're going to begin to take this issue seriously, and I think we ought to, we're going to have to dial back the politics and deal with what is ultimately a technocratic question.
Well, I mean, Andrew Scheer doesn't really have a plan. And the
Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
I mean, that language was extremely interesting when you listen to it. Punishment and reward. He's been told to say this. I don't blame him. He wants to win an election. But it's interesting that today, this new generation of Democrats that were elected in the midterms are coming forward with a fairly radical proposal on climate change. And we have to be candid because we hear this all the time. Well, we may change, but what about the big polluters? What about India and Russia and Brazil and China and the US? If the US does change, the world will listen. But we're a country that's often led the way. And I do think in years to come, I mean, I'm trained as an historian, and we look back on the past and say, why didn't they know at the time? Well, they did know, but they didn't do anything at the time.
Here's something I want to introduce in just the last minute, but it speaks to what we've been talking about. This is a quote from former Prime Minister Stephen Harper from a speech which was quoted in Maclean's, okay? And it says, let the other guys do a carbon tax because we can all win the next federal and provincial elections on that alone. Muneeza, what do you think?
Well,
is that true?
Interestingly enough, I think, Andrew Scheer is using those exact catchphrases and hinging on that comment essentially, and again, being opportunistic. The reality is, Carole, if in fact there was a plan, we shouldn't be hearing, let us unveil the plan. That's what the Conservative government should have been leading with.
If the Prime Minister goes out though and says, okay, Sean, to your point, we're going to be upfront about what it's going to take and how much money it's going to take and the pricing of carbon to actually make a dent in this, and it's going to hurt, would the Prime Minister's party lose the election?
It's quite possible. I think we are walking backwards into what could be a single issue campaign between the Prime Minister arguing for carbon taxes and Andrew Scheer arguing against them, and ultimately it having a decisive effect on Canadian climate policy. In many ways, Carole, similar to the 1988 campaign. And so I think it will behoove the Prime Minister to make the case, and I think for that reason alone, there ought to be a higher level of ambition on the part of the government to match the style with the substance, so to speak.
I don't think the stakes are high on this issue, Carole, unless I hear that plan unveiled from Andrew Scheer. But based on what I hear right now, I don't think the stakes are high on that. I simply don't.
All right, few seconds left, Michael.
Isn't it depressing that we're ending on this conclusion? And I agree with it. I think that if a party went into an election with a radical plan on climate change that would save this country as well as a large part of the world, all of the world, there's a good chance, they would lose the election. Isn't that tragic?
All right, we'll leave it on that note. Michael Coren, Muneeza Sheikh, Speer, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thanks, Carole.